In today's FSI Spotlight, I got a chance to speak with Patrick Sells, the winner of this year's American Banker's Digital Banker of the Year Award. Patrick is an award-winning entrepreneur, and he's on a mission to transform financial services through the fusion of Bitcoin and banking. He just accepted a new role at NYDIG as a head of their bank solutions business, and prior to joining NYDIG, he was the Chief Innovation Officer at Quontic Bank. It was a really exciting conversation. We talked about his move from Quontic to NYDIG, as well as the role of digital currency in the future of banking. Let's jump in. Thanks for joining us today, Patrick, and congrats on being named the American Banker Digital Banker of the Year in 2020.
Thank you, Lance. And, I've loved watching these shows that you guys have put out, and very happy to be part of the FSI community. So glad to be talking today.
Great. And so you've got on the yellow shirt, I've got on the red shirt. I think this will be the most colorful spotlight that we have done to date.
If we had one more person wearing a green shirt, we'd make a stoplight, right?
That's perfect. Yeah, or a dashboard with KPIs, right? Yeah. So, all right, give us the Patrick Sells story in 3 minutes or less. Can you do that?
That's a tough one, but I'll try my best. So at my core, I'm an innovator and an entrepreneur in one sense, I think. In another sense, very much focused on how do you make the world a better place? I grew up with parents who worked in the missionary world, if you will. And so I've always had an orientation towards what's the impact of my life and making it about how do you benefit others. And so I think there's a piece that's entrepreneur and innovator. There's another piece that's very focused on for what purpose, kind of the purposeful part of it. And then I think the third piece is, I've always loved technology. While I can't code myself, I think I've always been just fascinated by technology and what it means and how it can be used to invent a business and how it can be used to better the world and the scale that I think comes with technology. And so the Patrick Sells story, I guess, has really been one since I was 17 years old. I started building websites for manufacturing companies and would turn that into a marketing agency, got involved with helping run and build a kind of social media driven charity. Those two projects or businesses ultimately connected me to a bank in New York and became a banker. And so, really, I've moved around a lot, both as a child and as an adult. And so, I think in there probably encapsulates me. I've got live free, love others tattooed on my arm. That's kind of my motto for life, if you will. And focused on learning, curiosity, being exposed to new events and experiences and what can we learn from that. So, I don't know if that's the typical answer for you, but that probably I would say sums up the Patrick Sells story.
That's perfect, man. Love the tattoo.
Thanks.
So I noticed your announcement yesterday on LinkedIn that you have resigned from Quontic Bank and accepted a new role at NYDIG. So I'm sure you have a ton of mixed feelings about this career move. Anything else that you would like to or that you can share with us?
Yes, definitely bittersweet. I would move to New York City and join Quontic a little over 2 years ago, and absolutely fell in love with community banking. And Quontic uniquely has the Community Development Financial Institution designation from the U.S. Treasury, which only about 150 banks have. And that means we're very focused on serving the underbanked and low income. And so getting to be a part of a CDFI bank, the community banking industry, I think in the history in America, community banks have played such a pivotal role. And over those 2.5 years, really being able to be a part of the Quontic story, the innovation, the joy, the fun, it was incredible. Built a lot of great relationships and the team there. And I felt like in maybe some senses it was a little too soon to leave, if you will. There's so much momentum. I think Quontic is absolutely poised to have its best year next year, and excited to be able to watch that. And at the same time, very excited about my new opportunity at NYDIG. I was able to get to know NYDIG over the last 12 to 18 months as a partner at Quontic. And I think that probably, honestly, Lance, helped me some emotionally with the move. Like, yes, I'm leaving Quontic, but at the same time, I'm at a partner of Quontic's. And so I still get to be involved with what's going on. So NYDIG is really the kind of premier institutional custodian of Bitcoin, and they really have a vision for how Bitcoin the role it should play in society and life. And I'm sure we'll talk about it more later, and just the credibility that they've built in the infrastructure. Very excited in the mission and vision, but very bittersweet. Excited I still get to be partners with Quontic, and excited, as always, for a new opportunity. And I guess I also have to always mention that whenever we do something new, there's always that little bit of anxiety, like, well, can I do this? Will I be good at it? And definitely weave some of that in there as well.
So yes, I absolutely want to jump in to NYDIG, but before we move on into your future, let's just touch for a moment on Quontic. What were you able to accomplish? Maybe what were some of your goals, perhaps challenges, if you want to share those. But primarily, what legacy do you feel like you were able to leave behind?
It's a good question. It's one I think I've been trying to reflect on some myself, even in kind of leading up to this transition. And, I very firmly believe that in an organization, it's not about ever one person, and an organization is not dependent upon one person. I think, I recognize I was able to play a critical role at Quontic. And so if you think about the legacy, I guess it's really about more who Quontic will become. When I got there, Quontic, like many community banks, is facing a lot of new forces and factors in their world around technology and how does all that work. And obviously going through COVID was a unique time, but I think Quontic had this amazing kind of ethos and group of people about it, and this kind of entrepreneurial attitude that many banks don't have. And really, I think what probably was able to help accomplish the most was helping Quontic articulate that in a way that was very clear as to who they are and where they want to go. And I think for all of us in our own lives, to the degree we feel very confident in our identities, it helps us make all kinds of decisions. And I think in particular, that notion of identity in business is probably a bit more vague and hard to do, especially as a bank. So I think I hope the legacy, I guess, I have left at Quontic is really that Quontic established an identity that is far beyond me or anyone there, and will be able to carry that out into the future. And look forward to being a cheerleader of theirs, and again, watching and helping as a partner.
So before we move on to NYDIG, what would be perhaps your thesis statement for community banks? If there would be one recommendation that you would have for community banks at large, what would that be?
I think to be aware of something that I feel like acutely noticed this year was able to be more engaged in the industry, and that is the greatest existential threat for the industry is recruiting and the culture. It's the talent, right? I think there was a time in America's history where going to work at a community bank was prestigious, and it was vibrant and meaningful. And young people would come out of college and say, I want to go work at a bank. And, in the last decade or two, when was the last time you heard someone say that? It's few and far in between. And that's tragic. And I think the reason why banks are struggling with technology and innovation, that's a symptom, right? There's a lot of energy and attention to fintechs and what kind of technology do I need, but we're really addressing a symptom. I think why banks are in that position is because the first, what I call digitally native generation that grew up, didn't want to go work at a bank. They went to a farm to table restaurant. They went to a technology company. They went somewhere else. And so in the world that we live in, technology is everywhere, right? There are lines of code literally going all around us. It powers a lot of our lives. It doesn't matter how old school or new school you think you are, technology is here, and you need to be able to attract that type of talent that's digitally native. And it's not that you only need that, you need the mixing, the combination of both the bankers who know about regulations and compliance and the maturity that comes with, decades in banking, but you need to combine that with this digitally native generation that will fundamentally look at it differently, right? Digital to that generation is not, do we have Zelle or do we have mobile bill pay? That's a thing. Digitally native is, how do you infuse technology into everything that we're doing, right? And so I think my encouragement for community banks is, if you want to attract that talent, recognize that if you want to attract that talent, it's going to start with your culture, right? That's why my generation and the younger generation didn't go there. There are things about it that just don't feel right, don't jive. And that's, I think if you fix that, the talent will come. And when the talent comes, the technology will come. And if we don't do that and another decade goes by, I don't know.
So let's pivot into the future. Tell us about your new role. Why NYDIG, and what do you hope to accomplish in that new role?
Yeah. So really the catalyst for why I would come join Quontic was when I met Steve, who's the CEO there. Really kind of hit it off together as friends, if you will, around this notion that Bitcoin and banking could coexist. And in fact, I would go farther to say it should coexist, right? The two should be symbiotic. And throughout my time at Quontic, was really spent a lot of time thinking about that and working with the regulators and understanding the technology infrastructure of banks and Bitcoin to make that a reality. And so as Quontic's been working on a project related to that I don't want to steal their thunder. I'll let them share when it comes out. But that's how I got to meet NYDIG a little over a year ago, and we're partnered with them and really fell in love with who NYDIG is, the culture, the approach, the people that they have. NYDIG is, I'd say, really the leading institutional custodian of Bitcoin. They're not a crypto company like Coinbase, if you will, or others. They really are a financial services company that is engaged in the world of Bitcoin. And so with that understanding, they've brought a very different approach, one that's really grounded in understanding the regulations, understanding compliance, understanding what it means to be audited. And that is, everywhere throughout the organization. So I really loved the innovative thing that Bitcoin is, with this very mature approach to, okay, so what, right? Like, what does that mean? How will organizations and people be able to trust this, be able to use it? And NYDIG has built this incredible infrastructure. And so my role at NYDIG will be to the head of bank solutions. And this really means I get to live out, my belief that Bitcoin and banking should coexist and be symbiotic. And I think in particular, one of the ways that, focus on that is bringing Bitcoin related products and services to the financial industry, right? Whether that's a bank, a fintech, a credit union. Today, 40 million Americans own Bitcoin. And that's despite the fact that they're having to acquire that from this exchange entity that they've never dealt with in the past. They don't know if they trust it, right? If you think about that, how many more people would own Bitcoin if you were able to get this financial asset from your bank? Like, you know your bank, you trust your bank's regulated. And what would that mean for Bitcoin overall? And so instead of trying to build a consumer facing brand, we're really saying, look, we want to be the infrastructure to bring this to banks so that your bank can have the ability to let someone buy, sell Bitcoin or to hold it. And the bank doesn't have to do that work. That's what we at NYDIG can do. But you can bring that function. It's really, I think, becoming table stakes. Again, 40 million Americans have this financial asset that banks don't play any role in their lives. And so that's one of the things we're going to be working on. And, the regulations from, the OCC this summer really opened up the game. I think they recognize this is critical too for the industry and for America. And farther that, I think this notion of Bitcoin rewards, like we've built a engine to empower that. So if you have a credit card, for example, every time you swipe a card, what if you could earn a Bitcoin reward instead of a point? And what would that mean, right? And I can't help but be fascinated by that. Could be maybe the most powerful reward program ever. If I earn a point today from swiping my card, it's only worth what it's worth, and likely it goes down over time. And it's also not liquid, right? So what kind of a reward is that? Whereas if I earn Bitcoin as a reward and Bitcoin goes up over time, then that reward's gone up, right? It's the only reward that actually stands the chance to appreciate in value. Yes, it could go down in value, but I think, as a consumer, I earned that reward. And so how much does it really bother me if it goes down versus what it stands as an upside, especially when you understand the difference between money I've invested into Bitcoin? If that goes down, I'm going to feel differently about it, right? So I think it fundamentally kind of changes the risk reward spectrum of it and lets you all of a sudden maybe, start earning some Bitcoin, that see what happens with it and get to know it without taking as big of a risk. And lastly, I think, again, unique to it is you can sell it. It's liquid, right? Like, you can't sell your hotel points. And so it's universal in nature. So that's another example of being able to bring these, what we call white labeled products, to financial institutions. So if you want to run a debit card or credit card rewards program, we're ready to go. And so that's really, NYDIG has built this infrastructure that takes everything into consideration, from the regulatory, security, compliance, accounting. Where you are the premier one, and now it's how do we build that piping to make this available to all of America.
That's exciting, man. Sounds like you got a heck of a mission in front of you. It'll certainly keep you busy. So going back to the banks and their mindset, how would you encourage traditional financial institutions to open their minds to the real possibility of crypto as more than just an investment, but a legit medium of payment?
I think it's a very interesting question to pause on. One of the things I became really focused on this last year is the power of words and what do they mean. And so one of the words we use is cryptocurrency. And so that implies currency in the sense of more of a means of transacting. And yes, Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency can actually be used as a medium of payment. But I think that's just a aspect of it. I think the real value of Bitcoin is it is a store of wealth, right? Today there's over $300 billion of wealth that's been put into it. And so I think and to me, that's really the transformative power of it. If you think about any other store of value currently or in the history of the world, what we know about it is, this is where the law of supply and demand come in. And so when there's an unlimited supply, it's hard for demand to maintain a certain value in it, right? And so every other thing that's ever been a store of wealth had really at some level an infinite amount or a never-ending amount of supply, whereas Bitcoin is truly finite. There can only ever be so many Bitcoins. And so now when you think about a store of value, it's the first time purely you have a finite supply. And so what does that mean? And I think that's what we're seeing even this year, the institutional and people who are buying Bitcoin and holding. Like, here's a fascinating data point. If you look at all the Bitcoin that exists, on average, over 62% of it has been held for 1 year. These are people who don't want to necessarily spend it. Could you? Sure, right? I could go get a gold coin, and if I really needed to, I could trade that gold coin to someone. But I'm using it as a store of value, and it can be used as a form of currency. And so I do think there's a world in which Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies do become more of a form of payment. But again, I don't think that's the real transformative value of it. And so for traditional FIs, who are trying to think about it, you today are serving your customer through the primary store of value they have, their US dollar, their fiat. And again, now there's 40 million Americans who own this, and we know the average owner is keeping it for 62% are keeping it for more than a year. Like, you should play a role in being the safe, trusted service provider of that, just like you are for people's cash or your 401ks or your retirement accounts. And I guess I also recognize that probably many in the financial industry, especially traditional, it probably starts with they don't understand or really know much about Bitcoin. And so I think it begins there. I'm obviously very excited about it, but I've spent a lot of time learning about it. And I think that's really what starts with, Bitcoin's had this very interesting kind of story and culture, if you will, is what was it and how was it being used, and it's kind of nefarious or whatever. And I don't think that's really the point of Bitcoin or what the role it is, but that's very much kind of how pop culture, if you will, has maybe insinuated certain things. So I guess it starts with awareness, and then looking at the data, right? What do my customers think? If 40 million Americans own it, likely my customer today probably already owns Bitcoin. So what am I going to do about it?
As a tech and innovation evangelist, I know you're pretty passionate and excited about Bitcoin and the role that it can and should play just in the world in general and commerce. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that and maybe explain why you're watching gold so closely?
Sure. So I think absolutely kind of a technology evangelist, in particular Bitcoin. I think, again, going back to this notion of it's a store of value that is finite, which means it can't be manipulated or controlled by someone else. Like, we get to decide, who owns Bitcoin, and no one can say, well, there's going to be more of it, or I'm gonna, gold is a valuable resource, but some people own all the gold manufacturing facilities, right? You can't own all the Bitcoin manufacturing facilities, right? It really is something that I think is distributed in a way that's for the better as a store of value. And so, but even, and this kind of dovetails into the answer on gold, like if we look at what's happened even in, kind of America's monetary policy and monetary history, we obviously all know we used to be on the gold standard and now we're not. And so, what's happening is money can just be printed at will. In other words, there is no end to the amount of supply. And so while it may feel like, I think one thing that's kind of interesting to think about, like the stock market's at an all-time high, right? And yet as a country, we've probably produced the least goods and services ever. How are those two data points work? How can that be, right? And I think that's, again, points to maybe this artificial value of the US dollar, because we're just printing so much money. And we're not alone as a country that, does central planning, if you will. But that's very scary to me. And I think it seems as though it's at a kind of an unparalleled pace to maybe where it's been in our history. And so when I think then about gold, or I then think about Bitcoin, it's a store of value that is outside of that. It really is a hedge against inflation, and very much take the position that what's happening right now, again, is inflation, right? And it may not feel like that, but it is. And so gold is, I think, probably arguably historically proven to be the next best store of value. It's very hard to produce more gold, and so it keeps the supply limited in a sense. And so, very interested in gold, very interested in Bitcoin, really because it's hard for me to make sense of what's going on in our economy right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I'd love to get your take on the central bank, right? CBDC. What is the ideal future in your perspective, and or where do you think we're headed?
I wish I was wise enough to be able to answer that with any confidence. I think, I look at what's going on and can see things and make observations, but I don't know that I really understand it all. And I'm sure there's many parts of it, in fact, I don't understand. I think, look, the central bank is here to stay. And I'm not saying in any way I think it's inherently bad, right? I think, though, it's maybe become a bit unchecked. And so what does that mean? And so very much, it's not that it's bad or needs to be replaced, right? I think that what we can do, though, is create a monetary system that can coexist, like with Bitcoin, that fundamentally allows the preservation of wealth and the long-term storage of wealth in a way that kind of de-risks the overall financial system and what's going on. And so, again, it's not a replacement. It really is a symbiotic relationship that I think can and should coexist. So what's the future? I think who knows? Only that looking at the data that's happening, it's a little bit nerve wracking. I was talking to someone on Tuesday, I guess, or Wednesday, and he was saying that homes in his neighborhood, there's none for sale, and the average home has gone up by 25% since before COVID started. And in one sense, it was almost kind of like a, wow, congratulations, like my home value just went up, and I was terrified. How can that be? What's happened? And again, this kind of points back to what's happening. Yes, at one level, people are wanting to move out of the cities and going to other areas, but there's just some fundamental parts of this economy that don't make sense. And so I'm nervous about it. But again, I think America has proven in the world that, we'll take problems will come and we'll solve, we'll get through them. And I'm sure it'll be no different this time.
What is the future of banking from your perspective?
I think it's a future that's going to be very much driven by technology, right? The rate at which technology is increasing and becoming more and more powerful is coming into the industry, and that's not going to change. It's only, we know about technology, it only accelerates, and so it's going to become more and more technological, if you will. And I think also, my hope is it is become symbiotic with Bitcoin in many ways. Like I think, my kind of vision, and again, the regulators cleared the path for this, is that inside of my bank mobile app, I can have my money and I can also have my Bitcoin, and it's easy. And, I think Square has done such a great job with their Cash app, and it's exactly that. You can see my cash and you can buy Bitcoin and you can buy stocks. Like it's that, and it's using technology to make that one-stop shop. And that's what consumers want, right? And so I think the future of banking is much more about technology, much more about ease, bringing together, disparate parts of my financial life into an easy to manage and easy to understand portal.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So what are the challenges and constraints working against this potential future reality that you just laid out for us? Like what obstacles need to be overcome to make this happen?
From the banking side, it's going to take a willingness to take a risk and do something that's maybe feels a bit uncomfortable. And again, I think even what we're seeing from the regulators are, in general, innovation, fintech, and Bitcoin is becoming, they're showing us it's okay. Because I think what's happening is big technology and other technology companies are quickly getting into this space because that's what people want. And in doing so, yeah, they're solving the consumer or small business demand or problem, but banks are being relegated to being more and more behind the scenes kind of piping, right? And I think long term, that's probably not good for the banking industry if it gets reduced to being more of a kind of utility supplier, if you will, and more power exists in a few small technology companies. And so, but they've got a massive head start. One of the things that always kind of struck me as a bit odd in the industry was how banks would be very scared to say what they're doing to another bank. Like that bank's not really your competitor. It may feel that way, but there are forces far stronger with far more momentum and money taking place that are radically changing the industry. And banks should do a better job of working together. I think that's another major obstacle is, in one sense, we all are in it together. And in another sense, like it's every man for himself. And that type of thinking inhibits collaboration, inhibits innovation, inhibits, economies of scale. And I think that's tragic.
So you've mentioned a number of times when you've talked about innovation online, you're frequently talking about moving toward becoming a digital bank. So I want to get some context here for clarity. So first of all, the big question here is, how do you recommend banks approach innovation? And is innovation really for banks just about becoming a digital bank? Unpack that for us.
Innovation is oftentimes synonymous with technology, but if we go to the definition of it, it means to do something different. And I think innovation is needed where there really are problems, right? And so going back to what I said earlier in the conversation, I think the biggest problem is culture in banks. And so the innovation that needs to happen is actually there. That's the biggest problem. And but I think broadly, innovation should be looked at across all aspects of the bank. The computers that are used to work, the means by which we work, what the offices are like. It's to me much more about that and much less about the tool to have, from a customer standpoint. I also, and this is a little bit of a soapbox moment, all banks are already digital. Like you have a mobile app, you have online banking. So yes, you are both a community bank and a digital bank. You may not be a very mature digital bank, but I think if we don't, we kind of do ourselves a disservice by saying that, because it pits it as a either or I'm not that, or I don't want to be that, versus saying, no, wait, I'm actually both. And now I can decide what the balance is. But I think, again, this kind of either or conversation is actually a negative agent in the overall industry. So, coming back to what I started with, how do you recommend approaching innovation? Start with the broadest sense, the truest sense of the word, and look around your organization, say, what could be better? What should be better? And go do that.
So I think we both agree that behind the scenes at every bank is, a core system, a series of technology. However, I believe we also agree that some of that legacy tech that exists back there behind the scenes is in fact constraining innovation, or at least slowing it down. Are there any specific examples that speak to that pain or that challenge, and how are banks overcoming that legacy constraint moving forward?
That question, I think over my 2 years in the industry, my answer really evolved kind of almost every 6 months. And so at this moment, I actually don't know that it's the legacy systems that's the problem. I think, I was fortunate to be able to talk to a couple hundred banks one-on-one over this year about innovation and technology and everything, and even reflecting on Quontic. One of the things that I realized is, and most bankers know this, we have IT teams, and do you need those? But that's really help desk and network and security. It's not developers and programmers. And there is a fundamental difference in how programmers are taught to think and understand technology. And this is, again, even part of my experience. Like I started off very much wanting to, hate my core and wanted to switch cores right away, because it seemed like it was always in the way and never worked and it was slow and whatever. And I began to slowly realize through many conversations with them, and we actually tried to switch cores and I pulled back, was that no one at Quontic was a developer. So here we are trying to operate this complex piece of software that touches multiple parts of the bank. And yes, maybe something about your area, but you don't understand how it all works together. And so I think part of the problem is actually that banks don't have developers in them to help them understand how their own technology works. And yet we're completely dependent upon that core. And, and so it's hard to do integrations with the fintech if you don't have anyone who understands code, who understands how your core works. It's hard to think about automation or making things more efficient when if people don't have a fundamental understanding of how databases work, or how, programming logic works. Like, yeah, you may not need to be a programmer to use a piece of software, but if you have some of that teaching and experience, you'll be able to use it far more efficiently and more effectively. And that, to me, is actually the biggest problem. And that's what the nice thing about it is, that's easily fixed. Go hire some developers. Like we now, Quontic now has 3 or 4 developers, and right within days, we're able to help us start thinking about things differently. And all of a sudden, these pain points became less and less. Like, you don't need to change out your core. Your core may not be great for everything you need, but they're good for some things. And maybe that's not the problem. Maybe the problem is somewhere else.
So what is one trend in financial services other than crypto or digital currency that you're really excited to see unfold moving forward 2021?
Automation, robotic processing. There is so much about a bank that makes no sense to me in terms of like how inefficient it is. And I get it, we're regulated, there's a lot of constraints around it. But again, this goes back to, and again, I think where every bank can find common ground, because there's definitely ran into banks who are like, we do not want to be a digital bank. Okay. But every bank wants to be more efficient, wants to be more profitable, right? Wants to be, and guess what? Technology can do that for you. So think about digitally differently. There is a lot of what's happening that is manual processes, rote processes that you can have technology automate. We were able to automate over 500 hours a month at Quontic, for example. So outside of Bitcoin, I would say automation and RPM is probably the trend I'm most excited about.
Anything else that you'd like to highlight for the FSI community before we wrap up here?
Lean on your community, right? I think it's one of the great things about FSI. Like, and I go back to, we need to do more collaboration. Like, it was, again, kind of tragic. Like, I would hear a bank who was all excited about this one fintech that they had found. And the fintech maybe had 12, 13 banks behind them. And the bank I was talking to didn't want to tell anyone about the fintech because that was their secret sauce. And I kind of sat there and go, but we need them to, the more successful they are, the more reliable they are, the better their product is, the cheaper it is. Like, we actually need them to be more successful, not hidden, not like locked away, and to collaborate. Like, hey, you know, here's my policies and procedures for how I got work with this fintech, or here's my experience with the regulators. Like, partner together, lean on the community, trust in it, and let the community drive us to the future and where we need to go. So really appreciate, Lance, what you do at FSI. And so that'd be my parting advice.
Awesome. I absolutely love that answer. Patrick, you win the award for the day. So thank you, Patrick, for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lance.